everyone, welcome back to another Exos Heroes video. Today we are going to be covering the Unleash Potential, but specifically for Fated Heroes and Fate Cores, which is a new change to the Unleash Potential system that's been introduced with patch 2.3. This is something that a lot of people have been pretty excited for, and unfortunately it's also something that people are a little bit hesitant to invest in because it's pretty expensive. There's a new currency called Ultimate Orbs that you use to unleash the potential for Fated Heroes, and it's a pretty hard resource to get. So in order to get you guys up to speed and educated on how this system works, we're going to go through each of the classes, Chaos, Attack, Defense, and Support, and talk about which Unleash Potential we think is the most efficient to invest in, where you'll get the most bang for your buck. And so if you enjoyed this video, at the end please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Without further ado, let's get started. We are going to start with what we think is the worst class to invest in, and that's going to be Chaos.
Okay, as we jump in here, we'll just take this opportunity to take a quick look through exactly how the Unleash Potential works and what it offers in terms of the overall impact. So in the game, as you do the Unleash Potential, they're going to be a little bit different depending on the hero that you're working with. The higher the rarity, the less amount of upgrades you can get from Unleash Potentials. For example, if we're looking at the 3-star heroes, there will be a lot of additional buffs that you can get through Unleash Potentials versus if you're doing it on the 5-star hero. So for the 3-star and 4-star heroes, what essentially you will be getting are things to kind of improve your base stats a little bit and things to improve the scaling of your skills a little bit. So just things to make their basic kit a little bit better. But obviously, as you get to the 5-star or the later stage of the upgrades, you will not only get improvements to your base stats and skills, but you will also get special passive abilities that comes with your active skills and passive skills, and those are going to be the things that we focus on today. So with that being said, let's look at Chaos Heroes and why we think this class is probably the weakest when it comes to Unleash Potential benefits. So when we're looking at Unleash Potentials and the additional Unleash Potential effects that you can get on your active and passive skills, it's going to vary a little bit depending on what type of skills your hero has. Within the Chaos class, if your heroes have an offensive skill, with that skill you will get Unleash Potential effect that does bind for 2 turns whenever the attack hits. And typically, this is 2 to 3 turns, that's what we typically see. If your hero have a more supportive skills, for example one that increases the overall attack of your team or increases defense or crit rate, things like that, then they will be getting the Unleash Potential effect that increases their own attack speed by 30 or 25 in some cases for 2 rounds. On the surface, these effects looks pretty decent, but there are some caveats that makes them less reliable. So let's talk about the supportive Unleash Potential effects first. So when it comes to increased attack speed by 30 or 25 for 2 rounds, obviously that's pretty solid in terms of the overall benefit. However, if you look at the pools of heroes that can benefit from this, these are typically heroes that are relatively slow. And because this effect is tied to them using the active skill, they won't really get the benefit of it until their turn, which is going to come pretty late in the rounds anyway. And after using it, sure, they will move a little bit faster on the next round, but by then most of the time the fight is already over because as we all know in Exos Heroes, especially in PvP situations, the first round is going to decide most of the fights. Now if we look at the offensive skills, bind for 2 to 3 turns. At the beginning we thought, oh that's pretty good. But the biggest issue that we have with this skill is the fact that it only lasts 2 to 3 turns, which is pretty short. However, you can make an argument that if you do have 2 or 3 heroes that are all chaos, all have this bind, then they can potentially stack this to 6 or 5 turns. So that would be pretty helpful actually, and we do agree. However, the biggest issue with that is the cost. If you want to have 2 to 3 Chaos Heroes in your lineup all have Unleash Potential maxed out so you can get this benefit, that's going to cost you a lot of Ultimate Orbs. And compared to some of the later Unleash Potential effects, the cost effectiveness of the Chaos Hero effects are just not as good. So with that, we really can't recommend this to a lot of the players out there. Among some of the heroes that we can think of, perhaps Rira and Dorka would benefit from having this since they have relatively low mana AoE skills, and because of their fast attack speed they're able to get it off earlier in the fight, and having that bind for the first couple of turns might be useful, but for most of the other heroes it's just not that impactful. So unless you are a player who wants to and knows they can invest in multiple Chaos Heroes to benefit and stack the number of bind turns, it probably would serve you better to stay away from this. And lastly, let's take a quick look at the passive effect. And this is probably the worst among all 4 classes. What it does is it does additional 1000 piercing damage whenever you attack an enemy. And this is just terrible because 1000 is just far too low for the cost that you have to put in. You know, for most of us, if you have Unleashed Potential, you're probably in the mid to late game. You're looking at heroes easily with 15,000, 20,000 HP. And if you're really in the very late game PvP situations, you're looking at heroes that has 30,000 plus HP. 1000 is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to make any difference. Even though it's piercing, it's still not going to be all that impactful. So in terms of the passive effect, this is definitely the worst. With that being said, looking at the overall Unleashed Potential effects within the Chaos line, we just really don't think there's too much that stands out. And for us, this is the worst class. But now let's move on and talk about the next class, which is definitely a step up, and that's going to be Attack.
Alright, so now getting into the attack class. And this is a little interesting because this is the one class of the 4 that does not distinguish between supportive skills and offensive skills. So let's get right into it. No matter what your skill is, all of the actives have the same Unleashed Potential effect. And that is resets turn once per round if the owned mana is under 3 when a skill hits. So essentially how this works is, let's say you have a skill that costs 3 mana. And you would want to use this at around 5 mana, so at the end of you using the skill, you have 2 left over, that's under 3, then your turn's going to reset. Depending on which hero you have, if you have a hero that does have a either 3 mana skill or lower, then you can actually use another active, but otherwise you'll be relegated to auto attacking, specifically if you have skills with burst that will bring you to 1 mana at the end of using the skill. But then when it's your own, depending on what passives you have on your team, Breath of Mana, Flow of Mana, Grace of Mana, then you could potentially have more to play around with. But this is all stuff that you need to math out and consider when you're building a comp and deciding to run Unleashed Potential on certain heroes. And so one of the things that we wanted to touch on is regarding burst heroes, there are certain ones that work better than others. The ones that came to our mind was Maggie and Bathory as faded examples, where both of them have burst modifiers on their A2. And so after using that, you would end up with 0 mana as we had just mentioned. And because of some mana gain passives, along with the game mechanic where when it's your turn now you automatically gain 1 mana, the way this works is Bathory and Maggie both have 1 mana cost A1s. So this means no matter what, at the end of your turn you'll always be able to use another active on reset. And this makes them a little bit more useful because obviously using a skill is going to be better most of the time than auto attacking. Now despite this effect seemingly having the most synergy with 1 burst ability and 1 low cost ability, it doesn't always have to be used this way. So one instance that we thought of was taking Rachel as an example. So Rachel is an attack hero, and on his A1 it requires 3 mana, and it resets if the target dies. So one of the disadvantages of this skill is, if the target doesn't die, then obviously you don't get the reset. Now, with Unleashed Potential, if you have, let's say, 5 mana, or less depending on how many mana generation passives you have, then you could potentially use Quick Slash, have it not kill an enemy, but then because you've gone down below 2 mana at the end of using the skill, this turn reset would activate, and then you'd get the mana back, and potentially be able to use this again, and then if it kills the second time, then you would get the turn reset again, and be able to use maybe an auto attack, or potentially Quick Slash 1 more time on a different opponent. And so this is a creative way to think about how to use this skill. You don't always have to go A2 burst into a low mana A1, you could just spam high damage A1s, like Rachel's for example. We think this would be great, especially paired with his signature force. Since he is a general, he does have elemental damage, and this costs 3 mana, so using this twice on the same target is going to kill just about everybody. So definitely don't sleep on this turn reset. If you use it with burst, it may have advantages, but there's also other creative ways to apply this effect. Now looking at the passive Unleashed Potential effect, this grants 1 mana to self when the round starts. This is just general mana generation. It's pretty good because typically a lot of attack heroes do have the burst modifier on one of their abilities. Normally it's A2. And with that having been said, having more mana will let you do more damage, and because you get it at the start of the round, it's just passive generation. The more rounds you go through, the more mana you get, and it'll bring you that much closer to using your heavy hitting abilities. So now that we've covered the bottom 2 Unleash Potential classes, let's go ahead and talk about the top 2, which in our opinion is defense and support, as the most efficient to invest in. And so, Hal believes the number 1 is actually defense. I disagree, I think it's support, but I'm going to go ahead and let him give his argument first.
Okay, so when it comes to defense, I think the value really all comes through the passive. But that's not to say the Unleash Potential effects on the supportive skills are bad either. So let's take a look. So if you have a defender, and he has a supportive skill, so a skill that doesn't do damage, then the Unleash Potential effect you will be getting is increasing defense by 10% for 5 turns. So this is relatively good. As we talked about before, defenders, one thing you want to do, especially the ones that has ability to taunt opponents, you want to be able to absorb those damage. And improving your own defense is pretty solid. Would be better if it's HP, as well no signature force damage comes through without any defensive modifiers, so HP would be better, but defense is still not bad. On the other hand, if you do have a hero that has offensive skills, which most of you will at least have one offensive skills, then on that skill, you will be getting an Unleash Potential effect that deals 75% of your own defense as damage. And again, it's not amazing because in today's meta, when everyone is stacking HP, 75% of your defense, regardless of how high the defense you have, it's not going to translate to a massive amount of additional damage output. But nonetheless, it's supplementary, it's there, it helps you a little bit. Defenders are typically going to be tanky, they're going to survive, so you can count on them being there and doing multiple hits throughout the entire fight. So overall, it can stack up, but is it high impact? Probably not. But talking about high impact, the passive skill is what really gets us excited here. So let's take a look. In the stamina tree, if we look at the bottom here, which has the Unleash Potential effect that reduces all allies' damage taken by 15% and cannot be stacked. And this is just amazing. First of all, it doesn't have any condition, right? It doesn't require it to be on your turn, starting off the rounds, right? It lasts throughout the entire fight as long as the hero is alive. And 15% is no joke because it applies to everything. It applies to basic attack damage, it applies to skill damage, and it applies to even signature force elemental damage as well. So this is just great. 15% is a decent percentage. We do have to say it doesn't stack. That has a pretty big importance because since it doesn't stack, you really don't want to have multiple defenders. That means you should really just only be investing in 1 or 2 high tier defenders. So if you have a FC Garth or if you have a FC Shufraken, then just focus on those 2, get them to a higher level, get them Unleash Potential, and that's all you need, right? Having multiple of them, especially in the same lineup, is not going to help. So in a way, it's actually quite efficient because you really only just need 1 within each lineup. So overall, I think this is a very solid setup bonus. The active skills Unleash Potential effects are good, not amazing. Couple that with, in my opinion, a very impactful passive Unleash Potential effect. Overall, it's looking really solid. But now I'll turn it over to Edward and talk about why he thinks support Unleash Potential is even better.
Sure, so I think one of the points that Hal touched on actually is a great segue into why I think support is better. And really it comes in 2 parts. One is that right now there is a huge prevalence, especially in higher tier PvP, of signature force. And with all the ways to get generals now, more and more people are getting it, and you're going to be seeing this a lot more in player versus player content. So in order to prepare for this, what can you do? Stack HP and not defense. So right off the bat, that's one advantage support has, is that stacking HP is meta, and this is something you're already going to be doing just to prepare for PvP without even factoring in Unleash Potential. And another advantage is one of the Unleash Potential passives scales off of HP. So why don't we talk about that one first? And that is the effects for offensive skills. So any skill that a support hero has that does damage will also gain the effect of dealing an additional 12% of their own max health as damage when the skill hits. So this 12% number, as how it touched on the beginning with Chaos Heroes, the number can change. It can go from 4% to 8%, 12%, up to 16%. So this is just a rough estimate of what the middle of that range would look like. But honestly, 12% of max health is a lot, considering everyone awakens with redstones, which is more HP, these are support heroes that already have high base HP, and it could come out to be that 12% of max health is actually higher than 75% of your defense. So that's one advantage that support has already. And then for supportive skills, which also many supports do have, you grant status effect immunity to yourself one time, and this cannot be stacked. Again, with certain heroes like Anastasia, this is 2 times, but for most heroes we've seen, it's only 1. And this obviously is much less useful than the 12% max health damage, because it's more situational. You'd have to be targeted with status effect skills, which aren't terribly common. A lot of the meta currently is more about empowering your own team, giving yourself mana and buffs, and then just trying to one-shot the enemy. So CC doesn't really play a big part in the meta currently, but with Unleashed Potential, this could change, so it's still a nice buff to have. And then finally, the passive Unleashed Potential effect, and that is reduce damage against all allies by 30%, and this cannot be stacked. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, if this is 30% and the tank one was 15%, why would anybody ever go tank instead of this? It's literally double the value. Except, we all know how Exo Heroes translation can be. It's a little bit wonky. Sometimes they leave things out entirely, which we feel like is what happened here. Now, we haven't been able to test it quite yet, but we have heard in the grapevine that this actually intends to be reducing AoE damage against allies by 30%, and not all damage. Now, this is important because it leaves you completely vulnerable to single target abilities, which many heroes still do have, and 30% of AoE damage might not be as significant as you think, because AoE damage probably isn't going to one-shot your team to begin with, at least hopefully not in most situations. So this is definitely more niche than the flat 15% damage reduced effect that tanks have, but this is still useful and can actually be stacked on top of the defender effect. So if you run one defender and one support, both with their passive Unleashed Potential effects, you could be pretty tanky without actually needing to build tank stats, and we think that is where the real value lies.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what you said. I think the only reason why when I think about support Unleashed Potentials and I have them ranked slightly lower is because I do think the best Unleashed Potential effect you get from the support tree is going to be on offensive skills that does percent health damage whenever you hit an enemy with your skill. And that's pretty solid, as you mentioned. It can really stack up because supports are naturally high HP, you're building them with more HP. The only issue I have with that is when we're looking at support heroes in meta today, right? It's Iris, Shell, and that's really about it. And Iris, for example, she only has one offensive skill, and you're not always going to prioritize that over her supportive skills because a lot of times you really want to get that mana generation, things like that. So you're not getting the benefit of this additional attack buff all the time. So even though on paper it can stack up to a lot of damage, a lot of times you're not actually using it. In our opinion, heroes like Ramga, for example, who has 2 offensive skills and one of them's AoE, I think that would actually work really well with this Unleashed Potential effect. But in other cases, especially when it comes to Iris, I really don't think the offensive Unleashed Potential effect is all that powerful. But overall, I agree, support Unleashed Potential is pretty good, and it's definitely up there with Defense Tree as one of the better ones.
And so that does it for our discussion and our breakdown of the new Unleashed Potential system for Fated Heroes and Fate Cores. Now, this was just our ranking. If you have different rankings, different thoughts, or any information you'd like to share with us regarding the way Unleashed Potential works, please do leave us a note in the comments. Let us know your thoughts and we'd love to discuss. Now, with that having been said, we're going to wrap up this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe. There's more Genshin Impact Exo Heroes content on the way, so stay tuned for that. And we will see you guys in the next video. Peace.